Welcome to another webinar from the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. My name is Nasan Mahboubi, the director of the project, and we are in the midst of a cycle of publishing and discussing in these webinars the papers from our third cohort of project fellows. Today's program is the fifth in a series, and we are really excited to be sharing all of this in the lead up to the now rescheduled summit between Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping that will take place May 14th and 15th, according to news reports yesterday. Hopefully, any viewers of this program will know our project fellows have, over the course of the past year in each of our 6 thematic areas, written a policy paper with their own findings and recommendations that have been extensively ventilated in many rounds of workshops and discussions over the past year, including on campus here at Penn, including in a workshop in Beijing at Tsinghua University, and in Washington, D.C. in September, where they shared with various policymakers in our own nation's capital. And now we are presenting their work as almost final working drafts, still for ongoing feedback from anyone who reads them at this stage and watches these programs, and then we will publish them as a final collection later this year. I run through that entire schedule of our fellowship in part to situate what you're hearing in these webinars, but also in the sense of communicating to our fourth cohort fellows, who we are now in the process of selecting what this fellowship is all about and what they will get to experience if they are selected as fourth cohort fellows. So with that, let me invite today's speakers up on stage, and we'll get today's conversation going. You see assembled today are our trade and economics team. The moderator for today's program, Martin Chorzempa, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, is one of our alumni fellows. So he was a fellow of this program last year. And like many of these webinars over the past few weeks, we've asked alumni from our program to play the role that Martin is playing in the conversation today. And our speakers, our third cohort fellows, whose policy papers you can now read on our website and we'll be discussing the program today, are Matt Mingey, who is an associate director at the Rhodium Group, and Carrie Shang, who is an associate professor of business law at Cal State Polytechnic University. I'm so excited to hear today's conversation. These are great papers, really granular on the themes of trade and economics. Our framing for today's panel, of course, is limiting financial and economic exposures, and I can't think of anyone better suited to hand the baton over to than my friend Martin Chorzempa. Martin, I'll leave it to you from here on out.
All right, thank you, Nason. This is so exciting. As a former fellow of this program, it's just great to see it continue to put out really useful, impactful analysis. I'd recommend reading the actual full papers of both Matt and Carrie after this for all the attendees and anyone watching. So today's webinar is focused on trade and economics and a really timely subtopic of limiting financial and economic exposures, as Nason said. The analysis that we're going to see from both of our presenters today are going to be useful contributions to one of the greatest strategic challenges and opportunities that the U.S. faces with regard to China. Anyone who's watching this is probably interested enough in U.S.-China relations that they know last year the U.S. put on these enormous tariffs on China, which were met with tariffs on both retaliatory tariffs from China, but also cutoffs of really crucial critical minerals and other controls that China put on, which threaten not only the US and Chinese economies when you put it all together, but also supply chains all across the world. And while it's positive that both sides managed to find a sort of uneasy truce after this and roll back some of those restrictions and roll back some of those tariffs, this is very fragile. Both aim to reduce the other's leverage over choke points. And if one side innovates or invests its way around the choke point technologies that the other has on it, then it gains a lot of, reduces dependence and gains a lot of leverage that changes the strategic picture Yeah, fortunately today we have two really thoughtful, well-informed panelists. I've read both the papers in detail and really love them. They prepared these terrific papers drilling down into two really crucial parts of this big question. So Matt, who we're going to start with, has this piece that's just packed with insight on China's domestic economy and how it relates to what it can do overseas in terms of lending. And he spells out the implications for a U.S. strategy to both reshore and coordinate and finance the build out of non-Chinese capacity in crucial supply chains like critical minerals. And one thing I'd single out from his paper that hopefully doesn't steal his thunder a little bit is just a lot of people I think don't realize that the Chinese net flow of lending to the developing world is actually negative. That they're paying more interest on old Chinese loans than they're getting in new Chinese loans, which really changes the dynamics. So I would say, Matt, let's start with you and just give us a rundown of what you found in your research. What are your recommendations?
Thanks, Martin. Great to be able to explain the paper. And I think you put it excellently up top, framing the challenge as one not just about critical materials, but basically what do financial and trade relations look like as we have this time of increasing tension for all of the reasons that you outlined. My paper focuses on trying to level set what China's activity is in those domains, what it means for the United States. Obviously, China's outbound finance and the United States' own goals for trying to rework critical supply chains, rework economic statecraft patterns, ensure its own sort of supply chain and value chain security. All of that's very, very important. It requires us to have a good baseline for understanding what China's actually doing. But what I really want to do in my paper, and hopefully push forward even marginally, is rather than focus on some of the constraints on China's outbound lending and investment that has been successful and unsuccessful in various ways, what is it that the United States can learn as to how China has responded to those constraints, how it may or may not be bouncing back from some of the recent lows in terms of global finance, if it wants to accomplish all of the goals that it says that it wants to accomplish across those different domains. And so the paper tries to take it in maybe three parts. First, to explain what is happening, digesting a lot of recent data and change in estimates on what Chinese banks and firms and state actors are up to internationally. As you pointed out, part of that is just going over some of the understated phenomena, such as a shift from net lending towards net repayment for Chinese developing finance, but also responding to some big high-profile papers that I think offer a lot of very good detail on China's firms, fill in some gaps, especially when it comes to particular areas, particular sectors, but might lead you with a misapprehension of the ongoing problems that China faces, that its firms face, that its banks are facing overseas. And you could probably sum that up as reports of the BRI's resurgence are potentially overstated. And I go through some of those major papers, explain what I think are the strong points, especially in the coverage of advanced economies and how they relate to China. And then also where I think they can be a little bit misleading when you start trying to treat issues of construction contracts to backfill for some of the decline in China's lending, or when you start looking at PBOC swap lines as a replacement for the kinds of investment that we were seeing several years ago, to try and right size what China's engagement is, to get a sense of what the challenge is for the United States, and also acknowledging that there has been a lot of success on China's side. I mentioned the Simandou mine that's just recently opened in sub-Saharan Africa that is going to definitely upset the apple cart when it comes to global iron ore markets. And there are many other projects or investments that we could talk about in terms of the paper. But in the paper, really want to try and point out, and that's why the paper is titled The Financial Limits of China's Overseas Engagement, that it is not a situation where everything is fine because you see an uptick, a small one, in terms of loans and investment from that COVID low. China still has financial constraints. Whether you're talking about the situation for policy banks that have been really, I don't want to say distracted, but at least charged with doing a lot to try and stimulate China's domestic economy, channel credit into the domestic economy to try and counteract the property crisis and sort of growth slowdown in the post-COVID period. You have ongoing issues of managing debt, some of which have still not been resolved despite some moderate progress in some multilateral negotiations that are a problem for both China's commercial banks and China's policy banks. And by policy banks, I'm talking about China Export-Import Bank, China Development Bank, really some of the most clearly state-connected banks and policy lenders. existing problems with firms who obviously have a set of variable conditions at home, and commercial banks who are suffering from issues related to non-performing loans, having their own issues navigating domestic and foreign markets, and are having to think about things differently. But it would be a mistake to stop there. These actors and China's policymakers as a whole are pivoting and adopting new strategies to respond to these constraints and respond to these risks. Some of these are just straight policy, risk management policies at either the bank level or the national level, internationally, such as new ESG or reporting requirements, new risk guidelines inside some of the banks that correspond to more international definitions, taking a cue from the IMF in some places. And in other cases, it's just tapping different actors. We're seeing a lot more being done by private corporations, a lot more being done by state-owned commercial banks rather than policy banks, a lot more syndicated lending, as I go into some detail in the paper, a lot more co-financing or on lending with multilateral development banks like African Development Bank, so that it is not necessarily Chinese lenders that are left holding the bag. There are more parties to kind of spread out the potential risk and expanding, continuing to use major backstops like Sinosure. China in the past few years has been really working on trying to get its institutions to do the thing that they do best, whether that's in terms of refining the aid architecture, refocusing what policy banks should do, tapping commercial banks and firms to do what they do best, especially in solar power, green energy, critical minerals, and backstopping it all with state guarantees. The question then is, what does this all mean for the United States? I think it's worth pointing out, and I try and do so in the paper, that the United States has tried to compete with what China was doing 5 years ago, 10 years ago before, and doesn't really have much to show for it. There's any number of these different counter BRI programs, attempts to compete on global infrastructure under various names that really haven't turned up much. It's not just the United States, the European Union through Global Gateway has suffered its own problems. There's been some controversy over there, some recent critical parliamentary reports asking basically what money has gone out and where has it gone. And I think that the Chinese experience right now and the way that Chinese institutions are contending with risk, shifting their financial modes of activity, offers some lessons for the United States. It's not a one-for-one. It does not necessarily take the strategy and import it wholesale, but there are certain pieces I think that can be picked up on from Chinese institutions, by American institutions, that will offer the U.S. a better chance, though there's no guarantees, of being able to meet at least some of these goals for critical supply chains, critical materials. That includes some emulation of China's approach to risk management in terms of distributing that risk, looking for multilateral co-financers, thinking very carefully and intelligently about where you get the United States government equity and guarantees involved, beefing up some of those institutions like the Development Finance Corporation where it makes sense. But more than anything else, and something that I go into a little bit in the paper talking about dollar recycling, avoiding the volatility in U.S. macro policy, fiscal policy, overall economic policy that just makes all of this much harder and makes an overall already risky global environment that much riskier. The paper goes into far more detail. We'll get into some of it here, but I really, really enjoyed writing it, and hopefully these will offer, at least some building blocks for farther analysis of what China's up to, how the United States is responding, and then what the United States can do better.
Thank you. That was great. So we kind of organized Matt to go first because he covers as broad financial constraints and whole strategy, and then transitions us perfectly into Carrie, who's done really great work looking at the pharmaceutical sector and a lot of elements within that, and also biotech. So she gives a great overview in the paper on the current reliance on China for key inputs, the implications, and how despite many U.S. efforts to try and clamp down on reliance in China, it actually seems to be intensifying because China is rising up the value chain, and then the U.S. is depending on them then in new ways that they weren't before, while not necessarily reducing the old ways. And one thing I would pick out just to highlight before she gives an overview of her work is that she's thought really seriously in her piece about a really crucial question I think we need to think about much more broadly when we're thinking about this big question of reducing dependencies, is that she's thought about how the US can continue to leverage Chinese expertise but being manifest in supply chains outside of China. So that, of course, doesn't remove China completely from the loop from the supply chains, but it might be much more economical and achievable to have the kind of approach that she is suggesting than what some people might want, ideally, which is no Chinese involvement whatsoever. So I will, with that, give her the floor to describe her what she's found.
Thanks very much, Marty. Thanks for the heads up. And my paper for the PIN project is going to be about securing American pharmaceutical supply chain through certain strategic engagement with China, in line with today's overall topic for the webinar, which is limiting the financial and economic exposure. I think my paper tries to address the critical vulnerability posed by this type of American over-reliance on PRC for active pharmaceutical ingredients. And how do we try to limit this type of economic exposure to China in order to minimize any type of national security and other type of economic risk? So before I present my findings and recommendations, I have to give you a definition for API. So there are going to be a lot of acronyms you see in the paper, but API is definitely the most important one. So what is API, or active pharmaceutical ingredient? A lot of different versions of definitions. So but you can think about that as any type of precursor to drug. So a official definition from the FDA, which is the U.S. Federal Drug Administration, is that API is any type of substance that is intended for incorporation into a finished drug product and is intended to furnish pharmacological activity or other treatment or diagnosis or prevention of disease. So it comes to three findings about China's overall API market dominance, U.S. Policy to try to limit those type of over dominance, and also China's rising biotech. The first finding is definitely going to be about whether China that's dominant U.S. API market. Answer is that depending on the type of statistical methods you're using, different researchers give the figures rising between 8% to 42% that China supplies significant amount of precursors materials, APIs, to the United States. They're mainly consisting of the different types of vitamins, such as vitamin B, vitamin C, vitamin E, and also big quantities of antibiotics and pain relievers. So so those are the figures, and this type of overdependence of this type of China sourcing for API is definitely problematic and dangerous. The reason behind this type of China's overdominance in the API market is modified. Apparently, it's a lot cheaper to manufacture APIs in China. The manufacturing cost of API in China is only about 35 to 40% of that in the United States, and maybe even lower than that. That's due to the cheaper raw materials, cheaper shipping costs, cheaper logistic costs, and also apparently cheaper labor costs. And also China definitely has this very big manufacturing capacity in API and many other different areas. And another reason is the Chinese government continues to investigate in this area, to invest certain type of money and efforts to incentivize API and other related research and development efforts. So what are the risks of U.S. over-reliance on Chinese API? Definitely, there's a quality control issue. There's concerns of fraudulent drugs. Many people still remember that back in 2008, there is a global crisis erupt when a very popular Chinese manufactured drug called hairpin, and that was turned out to be contaminated, causing over 350 patients to experience adverse events. When it comes to this type of U.S.-China relations domain, definitely the political volatility is going to intensify this type of risk of being able to over-relying on China's supply of API. China has been able to explore certain type of export control tools, particularly in the past year in the critical material sectors, many other areas. It doesn't mean that they're not going to manipulate or leverage their type of dominance in the API area, which is going to be definitely dangerous for the American patients. And the second finding is related to the current U.S. policy tools are trying to reduce American reliance on China. So those are apparently tariff measures, the fentanyl tariff, Liberation Day tariff, and other pharmaceutical tariff that are related to many of the DOC's ongoing 232 investigations and other investigations, executive orders, those certain orders coming from the FDA to try to reduce regulatory burden of building domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing plants, sanctions, and other export control tools. However, those measures, even though they're trying to reflect certain type policy approach that are trying to reduce dependency, and also those tools do have this capacity of reshape certain components of global pharmaceutical supply chain. That does not mean that they have been very effective. And ultimate effectiveness of those tools will certainly depend on a combination of different factors, implementation routes, and also coordination of other broader policy and in trade and industrial areas. And the third finding, which I think definitely is one of the more interesting one of the three, is that China has been really moving up the value chain over the recent years. So we're not only looking at APA reliance on China as that China has been supplying those raw materials to the United States, as Chinese pharmaceutical companies started to become very, very active in our licensing market, which basically mean that Chinese pharmaceutical companies are increasingly trying to grant their rights to develop and commercialize their innovative drugs outside China and to the United States, and in exchange for certain upfront payments. And this kind of shift this risk dependency picture, because we have to understand manufacturing of drugs is take place in many different places. So it's not that we only purchase their technology as we're licensing their technology. We also have to kind of depend on huge part of manufacture route. APIs and other drug precursors in China. So this type of new type of dynamic between US and China in the pharmaceutical area actually means that switching cost is going to become more substantial as American companies are working more with Chinese innovatives in areas of advanced therapeutics, cancer treatment, and in many other advanced areas such as gene sequencing. And so those findings actually mean that even though China has been developing its technology, and we are working with Chinese companies, pharmaceutical companies in different upfronts, that doesn't really entirely resolve this over-dependency issue. It just asks us to look at this whole thing from different angles. So when it comes to recommendations, there are three major recommendations that comes from the paper. First one is supply chain de-risking. So I definitely recommend that to reduce this type of critical dependency, we should build a more resilient pharmaceutical supply chain. So in that, I recommend that the United States should be able to launch a comprehensive initiative to foster our industrial partners and key allies to be able to increase their manufacturing capacity. The initial focus can be India. So I think the United States government should definitely invest more to have more direct investment, maybe loan guarantees. This is probably going to be a little bit tied to Matt's overall scheme, but I think those federal initiatives should be able to use to incentivize manufacturing in our allied nations, and we can have more joint venture facilitation with them, and also maybe to be able to provide manufacturing in allied nations with more tariff incentives. And not even that, I think to ensure the long-term success, you can not only invest the money, the US should also try to invest in any type of human capital with its partners by being able to support the creation of some joint job training and other type of certification programs in those allied.
Okay, we had to be pretty quick for the next two recommendations so we can keep the discussion moving.
Sure. And what the second recommendation and third recommendation I might be able to talk about them together. So in the second recommendation, I recommend a trust supplier pathway that certain Chinese companies might be able to get eligibility by being able to pass this verification requirement, so that in certain commitment that they commit to move their entire manufacturing process in very specifically designed onshoring places or allied nations in exchange for expedited regulatory review and government commitment of preferential treatment during procurement process. Third recommendation would be to condition on certain major Chinese out licensors in their licensing arrangements with American licensees. I recommend that executive branch should be able to establish more formal policy to require any pharmaceutical product developed in China and licensed and sale in the States to undergo more interagency government review to make sure secure production, supply chain transparency, and better intellectual property data safeguards. So those are my three recommendations.
Great, thank you for that. So my first question is going to be the same question to both of you. And I would also note that for all of our attendees, you can go into the Q&A and write any question that you're interested in asking either or both of our attendees. But of course, I've prepared a few myself in the interim before those come in. The first would be to both of you, why have previous efforts failed from the United States? So Matt, in your piece, you noticed that Build Back Better World has not been very successful. A lot of the existing attempts to kind of do some lending failed. We tried to do all sorts of supply chain organizations to try and move supply chains out of China. Is it just that the economic forces of Chinese production being so low, whether it's because of Chinese comparative advantages or something else, or subsidies? What is the reason that we've been unable to make progress there? And then once you answer that, the same to Carrie, which would be you outline that there were these executive orders and 232s, which is targeted sectoral tariffs and all these different things to try and reduce the dependence on China, but none of it's really worked so far. So why hasn't it worked, and why do you think your approach is going to be able to move the needle?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the interesting thing is that China's sources of comparative advantage, I think, have shifted over time. It used to be, or at least the received wisdom was, that it was just purely a matter of subsidies or ability to sort of violate standards, whether you're talking about investment projects or other development finance projects. But I think that understates, as you were saying, Martin, like legitimate comparative advantage, not just infrastructure, across a range of industries, whether Carrie's talking about certain elements of the pharmaceutical supply chain, you're talking about automobiles, you're talking about green technology, you're talking about mining, certainly types of infrastructure. One of the examples that comes to mind, though it's maybe a little bit out of date, is if you talk about early projects, Chinese-funded projects under a variety of modes in Africa, you dealt with a lot of imported cement. Because the quality was not necessarily there. Whereas now you have very, very well developed chains, supply chains, including a lot more experience navigating very, very difficult operating environments and advanced economies. Why is it still more difficult for the United States to compete with China? Partially, it's because its firms and banks are a little bit more nimble and have a bigger footprint. U.S. Plans and schemes, depending upon the sector, tend to move slower. They tend to be bogged down in bureaucracy. It makes it very, very difficult to organize. You have, it varies sort of by the institution. If you're talking about unlocking U.S. finance, there can be pretty onerous, not only study requirements, but also U.S. content requirements that can be waived under certain circumstances, but others not, which makes it difficult to find the cheapest outcome or to be able to make sure that you're maximizing your dollar. It still requires certain inputs that might come from China or elsewhere. And also, it relies a lot on trying to unlock private sector capital. It's a lot easier for China to matchmake, especially now that its banks have a little bit more of an overseas footprint, a lot more of an overseas footprint, going on to $2 trillion totally. Whereas the United States has not been able to do that. And part of that, I think, is because there's not as good a backstop, whether it's through guarantees, whether it's through other forms of financing for projects that potentially go wrong. It's not that China's solved this otherwise. we track many, many, many different negotiations, over 200 since 2000 that have been going on. But the United States is relying not just on private sources of finance and private actors, but also for a large portion of these deals or these projects, private sources of backstops, whether that's guarantees or that's swaps or something else. And so I think it's going to vary by sector, by geography, but taken together, it really shows that the United States relying on an outdated model that can't necessarily move as much, far more than any one set of credit subsidies or subsidized loans. And it definitely gets more complicated the farther down you get into these very, very complex supply chains. But Carrie can talk more about pharmaceuticals or supply chains in particular.
Great, thank you. Carrie?
Right, I definitely agree with Matt and the point that a lot of those policy tools are outdated and they're not sector specific enough. Because my primary expertise is international trade, and we all know that a common feature that's often criticized by foreigners about U.S. trade policy is there's just no consistency, right? So there's no consistency, and every time we have a new administration, then it's going to be a totally different goal that trade policies are trying to achieve. We're talking about to zooming in the area of pharmaceutical supply chain. I personally think that tariff is not a very great way of trying to achieve the goals. If you look at all those liberation and fentanyl tariffs, there are a lot of different exemptions that are already given to for our pharmaceutical precursors such as API and vitamins, antibiotics. So it's not so though because those policy tools are not specifically designed to be targeted in a specific industry, so that I personally think that there's no proportionality and their effectiveness are going to be hugely undermined because they're not targeted or specifically designed to achieve a specific policy goal. I personally think that, as I mentioned in my recommendation one, there's no way of basically trying to remove China from this picture. There's no way that we're not using China to manufacture anything, right? Because China is definitely still the world's manufacturing powerhouse, and China is facing this suppliers of manufacturing capacity thing. So it's trying to sell more to the world, and it's trying very hard to export in the past couple of years out of COVID and trying to recover from COVID. So I think that's something that actually can be utilized to American advantage. So both of my first two recommendations actually build towards giving certain type of preferential treatment to Chinese suppliers that are willing to be committing to this type of secure supply chain manufacturing requirements. We kind of require them to do, and also to be invest more both financial wise and also in human capital wise to be able to create more opportunities in our allied nations, such as India, for them to be able to have this manufacturing capacity. And I think this is going to be a win-win policy, and also it's a lot more specifically targeted to be trying to resolve this issue we're having.
Makes a lot of sense. So next question's for Matt. One of the critiques of the Belt and Road, which you talk about, is that it's kind of an everything bagel where too many different projects. I mean, I at one point was looking at one of the financial statements of one of the major banks, and they were describing like Chinese traditional opera performances outside in, Central Asia as being part of Belt and Road. So it's like, is it trying to offload overcapacity? Is it trying to build infrastructure and help, China trade more with the rest of the world? Is it simply about debt trap diplomacy? It's kind of everything in one. It seemed like everyone was trying to fall over themselves to just relabel anything as BRI. And clearly that approach was too exuberant, and they've had to pull back from it. What would you say Beijing's primary goals are now with its overseas lending? If it isn't, building projects anymore, and as you said, is kind of shifting towards more traditional forms of finance, is it just that they're trying to make money, and there's less of a strategic angle to it? And if you think about the U.S. side, you mentioned a bit about supply chains and things. If you were trying to prioritize the limited U.S. firepower that we do have into the areas where we could make the biggest difference, what would the best U.S. goals be in your view?
Yeah, two really hard questions. I got my work cut out for me, I think, for the edits on this paper. But on the first one, what are the overarching goals of China's foreign engagement now? I think you can't look at the BRI or China's current overseas goals or any number of sub-projects, or the Global Development Initiative or continuing engagement through the China-Africa Forum as divorced from the kind of trends that you're seeing in China's domestic economy. And you're seeing reflected in terms of outbound investment and in terms of investment projects, China's domestic policy priorities, which include a focus on new technologies, on green technologies, but also some of the shifts that we've seen in terms of domestic infrastructure development. So if you narrow in on, say, infrastructure investment or infrastructure financing, less in the way of hydropower, more in the way of long-term transmission lines or transmission assets. You're seeing that in Southeast Asia or in Brazil. And so you're seeing China's banks sort of following ahead, maybe with a couple years delay, some of the trends that are happening. That partially reflects Beijing setting the policy priorities, and the policy banks have to follow those. The state-owned banks are very, very strongly incentivized to follow those through various reasons. But I think it goes beyond that. I think it's also those are areas of Chinese comparative advantage, and it's where the financing makes sense. You have banks that, whether they're in an export finance transaction, whether or not they're part of a syndicate that's trying to build a global value chain in lithium from Latin America all the way through to China, or to expand on one, that's stuff that is bankable. And it becomes more bankable when you talk about the low rates that China has right now. And paradoxically, the upside of having a financial crisis. There are many other answers to the question of what China wants right now. There's an economic statecraft lens, there's countering the United States, there's leveraging up or leveraging down different sort of priority regional uh, alliances that it wants to have. We've seen this a little bit more in the Middle East, maybe a little bit less on Latin America. But I do think it's important to think about it as a whole, even if there's no one policy and it can be an everything bagel and everyone's trying to fit into some of those bywords. The integration between the domestic and foreign ecosystems and economic development plans, whatever you think of dual circulation, I think is real. And so look at home and look abroad and try and see how those things overlap. In trade facilitation, when you're reliant on exports to drive your growth for the next few years, it's not bad to continue to build ports or operating and to try and make sure that you leverage some of the investments you've already made. On the back half of your question on what the US can do, I mean, it's really tricky, right? You're not going to have the United States displacing China's role in certain supply chains. Critical minerals is obviously one where when you've got 70, 90% Chinese shares in mining or processing, you're not going to ding that overnight. But the idea is to try and get it to a reasonable level for economic security, and to sort of develop US capacity and maybe some alternatives and alternative technologies. I think one of the things that I point out in the paper is you don't want to be fighting the last battle in terms of just trying to go to Africa and trying to build a bunch of bridges and highways, although those can be important and useful if the price is right and if the risk is distributed, especially if you're working with multilateral lenders. For me, I think it is trying to identify what that level of acceptable production is. And then where does the United States form a complement, not trying to go it alone, as Carrie said, whether it's India with APIs or electronics production, but what do those integrated supply chains look like that allow sort of the United States and its partners to be more compelling together than they are on their own? You can see elements of this coming together depending upon the particular sector. And certainly areas where the United States is technological lead, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's AI and data centers, aircraft, although China's coming in strong on that as well, leverage those. But I really think the United States, at least for now, is really going to have to pick its battles and try and invest smart, and not try and go it all alone. And it's far more important to think about where it can be complementary and work with partners than it is to try and think, well, the United States alone is going to dominate X industry, and that's going to be the hedge against China.
Yeah, it's a tough international reality, and that leads nicely to the next the question I was going to ask Carrie, which is, one of your primary recommendations is to try to incentivize Chinese firms to move their supply chains out of China and then supply the U.S. from there. I'm curious if you have a sense of how attractive this kind of deal would be for Chinese firms. You mentioned in your paper that there's something like a 30 or 40% cost differential between producing some of these precursors in China versus in the US. Do you have a sense of how attractive these other jurisdictions like India are? Can they compete on a economic side, or do we have to essentially come to American taxpayers and say, you have to be willing to give subsidized loans or, subsidize the production by a certain amount to be to get production to move into these countries? How do you see the economic feasibility there?
That's also a tough question for a non-economist. So I personally think that's I think first to answer your first part of your question, I think certain number of Chinese manufacturers might have this incentive to move to a different or to move their manufacturing facilities somewhere, if not to the United States directly, maybe to some of our allied nations, such as Mexico. I think there's a huge cost issue there. I mean, definitely, as I mentioned in the paper, there's going to be a cost differentiation. But think about all the reduction in tariff they can probably have, and also to minimize the transportation, the lodging, and also to be able to move out of China, to be able to build their manufacturing sites out of China so that they can sell more easily into the American market. Because as I mentioned before, and many of you that are economists are definitely know this better than me, because Chinese companies are trying very hard to recover from this shock from COVID years, because they have been overproducing. And Chinese market, domestic market has been very, very relatively weak, and there's a lack of direct foreign investment. So there are a large number of Chinese suppliers, not only in the pharmaceutical area, but definitely pharmaceutical areas, one of them are trying to move their facilities somewhere. So I think it's probably going to be something that we need to work slowly them or move them slowly towards, but it's not impossible. Another thing is that if there's no political dimension, if there's no this entire thing of U.S.-China strategic competition, I'm sure maybe more than half of them would be more very willingly to move their factory here. But now, because there this certain type of geopolitics between U.S. and China definitely has complicated things a lot for them. But it's also the same if they're looking at one of their allied nations, such as India, because China-India relationship is also not very good at this moment. So that's something that we should definitely consider in addition to the economic formula we're using to measure the possibility here. That's my answer.
That's sensible. If you're going to put 50% tariffs on India after telling all these companies to move their supply chains out of China and they've been moving them to India, that becomes a serious impediment to your ability to use that as a goal. So next, Matt, I was wondering if you could go over one of the things in your paper that I found fun was you give this this set of bullet points that list the ways that the U.S. approaches so far have kind of risked following the exact same mistakes that China has made, including, interestingly, two excessively state-led investment in terms of its outbound investment regime, and naming some examples that are quite recent that help support that argument. So can you outline for us the ways in which what the U.S. should not be doing?
Absolutely, yeah. And just like in China, it's always tricky to characterize sort of U.S. outbound policy for the last 20 years with to group it together too tightly. But definitely, I think lately, whether you're talking about critical minerals, whether you're talking about semiconductors, you've seen a more muscular role straight up in terms of government equity. Whether that's because it's easier for the DoD to mobilize under various sort of provisions that allows them to play the national security card, or because it's just a little bit, it reflects the administration's priorities of making deals and making the United States party to a deal, whether or not you're talking about taking a chunk of NVIDIA exports or anything else. I think that it's something that we're seeing more certainly than we did under Biden or some of these major counter BRI programs, which really were more about sort of guarantees and more about loans and debt investment rather than equity. I think on the one hand, it's interesting because this does somewhat shift some of the change in overall flows that we're seeing, at least if you're looking at where the dollars, the renminbi are going, where there's more equity participation, but also increasing use of public-private partnership sort of uh, uh, shells or vehicles in order to get both projects done in some of the infrastructure led areas, like rail or like roadways that were part of the BRI, but also in terms of critical minerals and Chinese corporations, other forms of commercial engagement. So it's not necessarily one for one, but it's of a piece. I think the risk for the United States in terms of over-relying on equity is that China can absorb equity losses, I think a little bit better than the United States can, or at the very least is used to it. And when you start trying to include government equity, I think you risk changing the calculus, the governance, and the approach to risk for a lot of these projects. In some cases, that's necessary, or at the very least, it's justifiable, where you're talking about very, very tough projects, like I mentioned, MP materials that failed once because it didn't have a government backstop. On the other hand, you risk not only an issue of moral hazard, but also the government trying to spin things in ways that aren't necessarily best for U.S. outcomes. And the other thing is that if you're talking about government equity, what is the limit? Like, what exactly is the backstop? What exactly is the stopping point, whether it's on the DoD balance sheet or the U.S. Government balance sheet? Certainly, DFC and EXIM balance sheets are going to be relatively limited compared to whether it's the China Africa Development Fund or any of these bank-led financing vehicles. I think it's going to be very tricky to go toe-to-toe there. The other thing is, and some of the other examples I point out are bureaucratic fragmentation. Everyone loves to talk about it on the China side. On the U.S. side, it's not much better. Whether you're talking about DFC, EXIM, Trade Development Agency, any of the number of actors outside of the Trump administration, let alone all the actors personally or in a personal capacity inside the Trump administration that are trying to do these deals. I think that it makes it very, very difficult to try and coordinate and think about first principles, as well as to navigate trade-offs, figure out what is a priority project and what is the best mode, let alone to try and attract private financiers that aren't just trying to make nice for the administration.
That's really
It's a
tough.
lot.
That's really tough, and I think the U.S. is going to have to maybe do a study. Maybe one of the next year's fellows is going to have to give a what lessons to be learned from state investment of equity in companies and how to have that not lead to regulatory capture and all sorts of negative implications.
For sure.
We have only a few minutes left, but Carrie, I wanted to ask you a little bit on your recommendation. How confident are you that these Chinese operated facilities outside of China, either in the US or in India or somewhere else, that they would continue to operate if the Chinese government ordered a shutdown, because it's trying to create some really costly embargo against the US? If we're in some I assume they would only do this in a really, really, really bad situation of breakdown of US-China relations, like a conflict over in the Taiwan Strait or something. But how confident are you that these facilities could keep supplying the U.S. if, say, their owners decided were told by the Chinese government to shut them down? And is there some way to address this by making sure that these inspections deal with some handover procedures that would allow this to happen? And if that's required, then would these companies actually do it?
I think that's a brilliant recommendation, maybe to have this type of handover protocol. It's something that I would probably need to add to one of my recommendations. I think if that happens, I would probably have to rewrite all three of them. The only thing is that I think that your question really makes me think of the parallel that a lot of American companies have been criticizing Chinese companies when we allege that they use this forced technology transfer to steal our technology during early 1980s, 1990s, which forced China to change their IP law. I think it's this type of learning is also two-way learning, right? As we're able to train more Americans or employees from the allied nation to be working in those Chinese-owned or China-owned production site outside China, then we're also going to be able to learn that know-how. So as long as the type of executive orders from China don't happen overnight, or doesn't happen overnight, I think longer term we should be able, and we should definitely invest from the beginning to be focusing on this type of investment in human capital, as I mentioned, to create this type of joint training, talent recruitment, retention program. But that's definitely something that we need to think about. It's not, I mean, if that happens, I think it's not fatal to my recommendations, but it definitely something I should probably think about when I'm going to be improving my recommendation, to think that direction. It's very hard.
And if you have a quick response to this too, I'm curious, you mentioned stockpiling. To what extent are these precursors and things, the kinds of things that you can stockpile for, say, a whole year, versus, they expire in a short amount of time. So like, could we build a big enough stockpile feasibly that would insulate us from disruption for, let's say, an entire year?
I think it's going to be hard, but maybe a year is the maximum number of time that we can probably build our stockpile for. I know there are a lot of different stockpiling programs that are being built already, so we might be able to get a real data there.
Very cool. So let me ask a last question to both of you before we hand it back to Nason. I'm curious of how your analysis and recommendations have evolved as you've gotten feedback in this program. I remember my initial ideas and what came out in the end was shaped by a lot of tough feedback from people in Beijing, Washington, and also in Philly. So I'm just curious what you think the most helpful suggestions you've gotten that have helped you refine the recommendations through this process.
Do you want to go first, Carrie?
Yeah,
Sorry.
to put me on the top spot. I think it's definitely a learning process. I learned so much from all the excellent lineup that the PEN project has arranged for this fellow. But I learned most from my cohort. So this type of intensive feedbacks, like we have been living together. We have been a part of all those seminars, those very intensive, fully packed day trips, Beijing, Washington, and also in Philadelphia. We have been exchanging those ideas and also learning from each other, building or from other people's expertise. I would have to be honest, the whole our licensing recommendation actually stems from my communication with the cohort people from technology and biotech. So I definitely think the most constructive feedbacks definitely come from our this type of discussions among ourselves, which is a fantastic experience from this whole project.
That's great.
I totally agree with Carrie. I think the biggest opportunity has been to engage across disciplines, for example, with more technical experts on either climate science or critical raw materials, which are really helpful. My biggest challenges were maybe being able to, or having to, I say being able to, like it was easy and fun, moving with new economic data on both the US and China side. And also having to reframe, I think, the most important policy relevant themes in ways that if they didn't necessarily match personal interest, at least what was most important to the times in the direction of U.S. policy. And speaking about, addressing the China of years past or addressing the old BRI, the early versions of my paper really focused more on aid competition and about more comprehensive sort of economic statecraft. What did it mean for U.S. aid shuttering? Could we make some recommendations for how to bring it back in a different way? Or nesting that in terms of trade relations, getting AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, African trade preferences back online. And then when tariffs persist, when AID is not going to come back, that there is a shift, at least for the next couple of years in what's happening. And when AGOA is renewed, if even for a year, you have to be able to roll with the punches and make sure that you're keeping your policy relevant. Critical minerals are always going to be relevant. Competition with China is always going to be relevant. Striking that balance has been tough, and I've been lucky enough to benefit from Carrie's feedback, from Nason's feedback, and the other panelists as well, and a lot of our colleagues that we've met with over the last year.
Great.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing that I think one point of this whole fellowship, and all of us realized at some point that, oh, I have the worst paper in our group. So I think that's something that we all struggle with, and also we kind of learn from our mistakes and also improve in this whole process.
There's definitely no worse paper once you've gone through Nason's suggestions and edits and everything else. So with that, thank you so much, both of you, and let's hand it back to Nason.
Well, as you could tell, I really enjoyed that last. I mean, the whole conversation was fantastic. Really granular, great questions, Martin. Really great responses from both Matt and Carrie. And I just really have to underscore how much I appreciated that last question and the responses. When we talk about this project, we often really emphasize the meeting at Penn and the opportunity that many of the fellows do take to go and share their ideas with colleagues in China, to do field research in China, of course, going to DC and sharing with policymakers. And sometimes I even forget to, when I'm kind of like marketing the program, to really emphasize how important it is that the fellows who are all in these different thematic areas get to know each other, and get to learn from the work of people in areas that they don't usually encounter. And so the fact that everyone kind of mentioned that really makes me happy and reminds me that I should emphasize that more often, because it really is a deep part of our theory of what this fellowship is all about, of exposing people to similarly deep and granular substantive experts in some other areas. So thank you all for a wonderful conversation. Thank you for highlighting that point. And thank you to the audience, both here on the Zoom and on YouTube. We will be back next week with our last of this series of webinars. And then, of course, we will be back with lots more content in the coming months and years from the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations.